Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Lea-Henry. And on today's show, we have a returning guest, a guest who has been on the podcast on two separate occasions, both of which I will link below. This is Meredith Shaw, Associate Professor in the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Tokyo and Managing Editor of Social Science Japan Journal. Meredith, welcome back to the podcast.
Good evening, and thanks for having me back.
Now, listeners will know that our last two podcasts were on a topic which I think most of your research, at least historically, has been around, which is North Korean literature. And this today is a slight departure, if I'm not wrong about that. So as a very first question, I might just get you to introduce your article and the topic, just so we're not slow walking it too much and springing the surprise too much on people at the end.
Okay, well, yes, this is a new topic for me to publish on, although it's not a new topic for me to be writing about or thinking about. Something that I think everyone who's interested in Japan and Korea politics has a theory on, which is, of course, the longstanding history disputes and why the two countries can't seem to get beyond them. And so this is my contribution to that debate. And the title of the paper is Godzilla versus Pulgasari, Anti-Japanism and Anti-Communism as Dueling Antagonisms in South Korean Politics. So what I'm looking at here is the idea that Japan exists in some respects as a foil to North Korea in the imagination of South Korean politicians. That, obviously North Korea is this huge threat, ongoing threat, even when it's quiet for a while. The psychological impact of that on the population is certainly considerable. And as an American, thinking about that, thinking about the politics of my own country and how anti-communism kind of gets reflected back onto liberals of all stripes, and people kind of think anyone who identifies as a social democrat or even a Democrat, there's not a clear understanding of how that's different from a socialist. A lot of accusations of communism fly around. And when you think about it, that situation has to be so much worse in South Korean politics because of their past experience. They fought this terrible, terrible war with North Korea, and North Korea has continued to behave badly and kidnap their citizens. So the paper starts with sort of taking a moment to feel a little bit of sympathy for the South Korean leftist who is trying to emerge in this world, particularly in the coming out of the period of dictatorship. And how the heck did South Korea get to where they are, where they have two parties that obviously have problems, both of them, but Liberal Party and the Conservative Party have traded places in power peacefully several times, despite all of this animosity. And so I started thinking, well, maybe part of this has to do with the existence of Japan and the feeling that while the left of center party is accused of being pro-North Korea, the right of center party can also be accused of being pro-Japanese because of some of their history. So that's where the paper starts. And it goes through exploring some of that history, how that came to be, and then some rhetorical analysis of the two sides in the last 10 years and how, when a North Korea issue comes up, a Japan issue tends to come up alongside it, and these two antagonisms tend to play off against each other in interesting ways. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what I was trying to do.
And a good nutshell it was. I might start my questions here with another slight sympathy that you started your article with, and that was with international relations scholars of a kind. And that was with this look at them and their frustration with South Korea. For them, this is this anomalous country that shouldn't be in the place that it looks for, as in the further you get away from these historical crimes and historical harms and problems with Japan, relations should improve. And the younger generations of South Koreans are not shown this in the way that you might expect. And of course, Japan has managed to improve relationships with countries like the Philippines and Taiwan and Indonesia and countries like this. But this particular relationship with Japan is sticking out like a thorn for international relations scholars. So I might, as the first question, open up the field, those frustration of those IR scholars out there.
Yeah, so I throw out a few examples of scholars, American scholars and British scholars, who kind of like to compare Japan and South Korea with the German-French relationship. That seems to be a particularly popular one. And I think it stems back to Western scholars think of everything in terms of World War II, and Japan and Germany were allies in World War II. Germany has a good relationship with Western Europe now, especially in combating communism during the Cold War, and Russia now. So there's this idea that Europeans have gotten beyond the historical animus of World War II, and why can't Japan and Korea do the same thing? And I think, first of all, that's kind of an apples and oranges comparison, because Germany and France fought a war. Neither one of them ever colonized the other. So you're comparing. The standard of apologies that we should be looking at is more of maybe France and Vietnam, or Britain and India, where you have this long-standing period of kind of extraction of resources, but also colonialization. And when you expect a country to apologize for that, it's more difficult than when you're apologizing for war atrocities, right? Because in a war, you're just wrecking things and killing people. And in retrospect, it's pretty easy to say, yes, that was bad. We should apologize. But when you try to apologize for colonialism, an interesting thing always happens, which is that there's always someone who comes out and says, well, hey, wait a minute, we built all these railroads and hospitals and things. And so it sullies the purity of the apology. And it's always going to be more difficult no matter who you're dealing with. Now, I certainly think that Japanese apologies in the past have been fairly ham-handed at times and could have been handled much better. But the idea that Japan has not apologized, or didn't apologize as well as Germany did, or at the right time, that, in my mind, that can't be the whole explanation, because the virulence of this animosity in the relationship today, and particularly in comparison with Taiwan, which had more or less the same experience and the same apologies, it doesn't explain why those two are so different. So you have to start looking at what's happening on the Korean side as well, and see what's different about Korean politics versus Taiwanese politics. What makes it so difficult? And to try to compare it outside of the European context, and look more at the context, the Asian context, and the colonial context that's missing in those European comparisons.
And on the other side of this, again, frustrating those IR scholars, but also political science majors, was the place that North Korea sits in this, and the anti-communist rhetoric that ought to exist and ought to be, and of course it does, but ought to exist in these really deeply fervent ways, is such fertile ground inside South Korea for this. Of course, there was an invasion in the past. North Korea consistently provokes from the North. And you write that, you would ordinarily expect South Korea's domestic politics to look like that of Philippines, more of a right-wing populist kind of movement. And again, South Korea is, again, defying and befuddling the scholars here.
Yeah, so that's exactly where I began with this idea of, there are two puzzles. The first puzzle is Japan and Korea, Japan and South Korea's relationship, and the second puzzle is, how did South Korea get to be such a, I mean, it's hard to say this right after the election we just saw, but how did South Korea get to be such a successful democracy, such a pluralist democracy, when other countries that have been threatened by communism tend to stay pretty solidly right wing, and countries that have had an experience of communism in the past. Obviously South Korea was very brief, but it was a very, very brutal experience they had of being taken over by North Korea. And they still remember that. So they know more than most how to fear anything that's kind of smells like communism. So how in this environment did progressive left emerge and become an accepted political party? And there are many aspects of this that I don't come close to in my paper, but I'm looking more at the at the possibility that Japan and this kind of settling of historical grievances really helped the emerging left to become a political force in the 90s. And they were sort of gifted these colonial edifices that had not been demolished. Probably the most famous one is the building the Governor General of the Japanese colonial era was kept in place, where Gwanghwamun Square is now, and that was not destroyed until very late in the democracy movement. And the Soremun prison, which I hope that you have been there at some point.
I have, yes.
If you haven't, I recommend it. It's sort of a monument today to all of the martyrs of the anti-Japanese colonial period, and also the people who protested against the military dictatorship of Pak Chung-hee and his successors, who eventually achieved democracy in South Korea. So those two things are sort of linked very beautifully in this prison museum that you can visit today.
Let's pause one last time before we jump into the red meat of the article and all those fascinating details. And that is with the approach that you begin to take here. So, of course, one of the problems with a lot of IR scholarship, or I guess it's endemic, it's part of the raison d'etre, is that it has so heavily focused on state behavior. And your article begins to take a different type of approach, focuses on speech and domestic politics, and begins to give a lot more weight to the idea of negative messages and how important they are. They might have a much longer impression than positive messages do. So I might get you to explain your methodology of a kind and the departure you take from IR scholarship here in how we're going to look at the details in the next question.
Yeah, so the theoretical structure that I ended up using for this paper takes its departure from securitization theory and the idea that these securitizing actors in a society, people with a lot of social capital like politicians, through their speech acts can can raise awareness of a particular object as a threat, or conversely, they can diminish awareness of of perception of a threat through their speech. And also the idea of rally around the flag effect, that if there's an external threat, then people are going to be more likely to support the party in power. That's a well-established line of research. But in this case, you have North Korea that's just kind of there, and it's there forever as far as we know. So it's not going away anytime soon as a threat. So how long can you continue to rally around the flag? And is there any way that the opposition could combat that by, if there was an alternative threat perception that they could build in people, or an alternative source of negative emotion, such as Japan and the history issues. So I developed this through two sets of hypotheses. And the first one is just trying to establish that politicians in South Korea will be more vulnerable to perceptions of being sympathetic to North Korea or communism if they're on the left. And politicians on the South Korean right, by contrast, will be more vulnerable to public perceptions of being sympathetic to Japan. So the first one is pretty self-explanatory, but I go through some examples from recent history. And I work a little harder to establish the second one, that politicians on the right have this vulnerability with regard to Japan because of their history, because of the perception that a lot of them are descended from people who benefited from Japanese colonial rule, and that they tend to be more interested in creating a security and economic alliance with Japan than settling historical issues. So I go through a series of tests for this. If this is true, we would expect that when an issue with Japan, for instance, comes up, like the semiconductors trade dispute 2 years ago, you would expect to see politicians on the right acting very defensively automatically, and politicians on the left sort of being much more enthusiastic to pursue some kind of retribution. And also when there's some kind of holiday celebrating the colonial victory over Japan, or colonial liberation, you would expect to see the leftist politicians kind of coming out and celebrating very enthusiastically. And you would expect to see the politicians on the right kind of pivoting to other topics and saying, let's talk about the economy, or let's talk about corruption, instead of talking about those old colonial issues. And the second set of hypotheses goes a little bit further and tries to see, are these two sources of external animosity, external negativity, actually dueling with each other? So when Japan comes up in politics for some reason, or when a politician is expected to make a speech about the colonial era, do the right of center politicians tend to bring up North Korea just randomly, like a non sequitur? And by contrast, when there's a holiday celebrating, or commemorating some sort of North Korean atrocity, and the president is supposed to make a speech, and he's a liberal politician, does he enthusiastically talk about North Korean atrocities, or does he kind of pivot to talking about Japan? So I look at these two sets of hypotheses through a series of recent events in the last 10 years where where some sort of issue came up, and because of the political dynamics at the time. Both parties made very public remarks, and you can sort of see how they either enthusiastically talked about the issue at hand or tried to pivot away from it. And in that way, get at the idea of one side being more vulnerable on the issue than the other.
Let's launch into the details and get into some of this. And you mentioned at the very start this this terrible, difficult place that it is to be a South Korean leftist. And I might start there with some of that. And I believe in your article, you call it the North Korea, the albatross around the neck of the South Korean left. And you go through how desperate and how much outreach people like Kim Dae-jung have done over the years. And you're right, he paid $50 million just simply for the pleasure of shaking Kim Jong-il's hand. And you talk about the national security law, which I'll get you to explain as well. But they don't always help themselves, the South Korean left, as well in this. And you go on to explain that a lot of people have been very imprisoned under this law for fairly innocuous charges. But then you have cases such as the United Progressive Party, which a lot of people have forgotten about over the years. But they had this really nefarious kind of background there behind them. So I'll get you to open that up, and then we can jump into the other side of that antagonism afterwards.
Yeah, so it's a hard topic to talk about because there's a lot of partisan dynamics at play, and it's a hard topic to research because you always have to kind of pay attention to which newspaper am I reading that's saying this. But I think there are a few things that can be established beyond doubt, and that is that the Progressive Party, various progressive parties over the years in Korea have gotten themselves into various situations where they really need North Korea to play ball, and North Korea just will not play ball. And they end up paying a huge price in terms of public support. And we've seen that most glaringly with Moon Jae-in, the outgoing president, that I think people are going to be writing books about this for a while.
I agree.
Why did he spend so much political capital? He had so much potential at the beginning when he had so much support at the end of his predecessor's scandal. And he could have done any number of things, especially after his party won the 2020, the midterm elections, won so many seats. And he just could not let go of this idea that we have to achieve some sort of deal with North Korea, and in the process wasted a lot of goodwill, and I think took some pretty extreme measures to silence some of the North Korean human rights activists. So I talk in my paper about how leftists have been oppressed by the national security law for various ridiculous charges over the years, but it's not just on the right that these abuses are happening in terms of free speech and free expression. It sort of goes back and forth. When the Liberal Party is in power, you see a lot of repression of people who are active in human rights, talking about North Korean defectors stories. And when the Conservative Party is in power, you see much more oppressive applications of the national security law towards people who maybe want to publish North Korean leaders' memoirs, or want to put some kind of North Korean propaganda on their Twitter feed, even just to make fun of it. You see a lot more applications of the national security law to crack down on that under conservative leadership. So it's a trade-off back and forth, but neither side seems to be really making much progress towards reducing these legal barriers to free expression, overall in South Korea. So it's very disappointing. And well, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
But I go into it a little bit more in my paper, some of the examples, and basically, I have sympathy for the situation of leftists in South Korea, but they've also gotten themselves into some situations that they didn't need to get themselves into.
On the other side of this, especially historically, is of course the conservative roots of not of I suppose Japanesism is a way, but this is a lot of people begin to target their anti-Japanism towards the conservatives. And again, in some ways you have to have some sympathies with them, and in some ways it's very hard to. So you're right, quite rightly, that after the colonial period, there was a lot of the development which came South Korea's way was on the backs of Japanese loans, and this was never been properly appreciated. That that this was a helping hand is often looked back on as this again a sign of people like Sang-min-ri and Park Chung-hee. They're probably not Sang-min-ri, but certainly Park Chung-hee's Japanese leanings in a way. And this is the thing that's always hovered over the heads of the South Korean right, that not just that they have some odd Japanese leaning, but they are actually the descendants of collaborators. And very interestingly, you write, and this is a quote, "Guilt by association has deep roots in Korean culture." And in this particular sense, they really do seem to have deep roots.
Yeah, so again, this is hard to talk about because there are many shades of gray here. But particularly Park Chung-hee and members of his cabinet and his supporters in the military dictatorship in the 70s are associated with having previously been educated in Japan or in Manchukuo, and having sort of an affinity for Japanese martial culture, that they were, obviously in some ways demanding that Japan pay for the colonial era, but also never really letting go of the idea that Japanese modernity had something beneficial to it that should be emulated. So particularly Park Chung-hee has some embarrassing, looking back on it, moments in his past, some embarrassing quotes and actions that he took that seemed to indicate that he really admired the Japanese imperial state. And these were buried during his rule, and subsequently during Chun Doo-hwan's rule still. And when the democratic movement finally emerged with a voice of its own, some of these things started coming out. And I think that's when simultaneously people started bringing into question the terms of this 1965 agreement, the diplomatic normalization with Japan. Started looking back on it and saying, this guy wasn't really looking out for Korea's best interests in terms of historical settlement. He wanted an economic settlement, and that was good enough for him. And so that's when you start getting this extreme interest in the historiography of the colonial era, and not just what Japan did, but particularly what the so-called collaborators did during the imperial era. So you have, in the early 2000s, you have the beginnings of some kind of civil society and also government organizations that are charged with looking into this, and they start to come up with some really interesting findings about some well-known and respected political leaders and chaebol leaders, and the most striking one from recent years is the guy who wrote the the national anthem in Korea, it came out that he was pretty enthusiastically pro-Japanese and also pro-Nazi. And so when this came out, people started saying, well, wait a minute, should we change the song? And the song itself is fine. It doesn't say anything about Nazis or Japanese, but that was when people started saying, well, what does it mean to be on this list? And what does it mean to be, can you still be patriotic in the colonial era and admire Japan? So it brought up a lot of interesting discussions, but it also brought up a lot of really animated emotions for different people. And the more this went on, I think the more it started to seem like the Conservative Party wanted to just stop talking about it, and the Liberal Party wanted to look into it more. And this particularly seemed to be the case when Lee Myung-bak became president, and the investigations kind of languished for a while. So it definitely seems like there's a partisan dynamic at play where one side seems to be a lot more interested in looking into this history than the other.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Korean App podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. Well, my very next question was going to be about Lee Myung-bak, so let's jump into that. And
Okay.
Your article begins to look into these interesting moments in modern Korean history. And there's so Lee Myung-bak, for people who are unaware, was the president before Park Geun-hye, and he was a conservative, of course. But of course, he's an interesting type of conservative. He's a conservative that is very hard to pin that anti-Japanese logo on. He has no family background in that sense. He was imprisoned in Sodaemun prison for protesting the 1965 normalization treaty with Japan. And yet, there's this episode you put in your article, which I'll get you to explain, about this trip to Dokdo and how he walks around it. But again, he is charged with being soft on Japan or pro-Japan in some ways, and that he's appeasing them in certain capacities. And I'll open the floor up to there to explain how someone even as unimpeachable in his background as Lee Myung-bak is still pretty quickly labeled anti-Japanese. Pro-Japanese.
Right. So he's not completely unimpeachable, and I think maybe I might have skimmed over a few things in the article, but he had family. I think his parents maybe were from Japan. He was in that generation that repatriated after liberation, and but that ironically made him one of the people who protested the normalization treaty with Japan in his youth. I didn't realize he was imprisoned at Sodaemun for a while for that protest action. So he can make a case that, yes, I have roots in Japan, but that made me know Japan better than most people, and therefore, he chose to rebel against the dictatorship normalization treaty with Japan, and maybe got some useful prison experience for later in life. Then he also he made the visit to Dokdo, but before that he got in serious trouble because he tried to push through a security agreement with Japan, the first GSOMIA agreement. And I don't know exactly why he thought that this would be okay, but he did it very secretly. And he almost got all the way through the negotiation without even telling the National Assembly about it. And so it seemed as if he was trying to kind of quietly sneak this security agreement through before it, without making a big deal of it. And of course, it was a huge deal. And it came out a few months before the election started in earnest for his successor. And so this was a big boon to the Liberal Party, which their main candidate at the time was Moon Jae-in. And then right when this kind of debacle is boiling over in the summer of 2012, he announces that he's going to make, Lee Myung-bak announces that he's going to make a visit to Dokdo. And this has never been done before. And it's a big deal. He had preceded it a year before by denying some entry to some Japanese lawmakers who had wanted to visit Dokdo. So there's a little bit of precedent to it in his administration, but it was also very surprising and very dramatic. And it has been cited by a lot of foreign scholars as the main evidence that conservatives care just as much about Dokdo and about Japan as liberals. But if you look at the response, particularly from then candidate Moon Jae-in, he was not happy. So he kind of has this, his spokesman issue a statement saying, why is it that the Lee administration has kept this low posture and hasn't said anything about Japan's historical distortions and claims to Dokdo, and they even tried to push through this secret security agreement, and then now all of a sudden they're going, he makes this trip to Dokdo and expects everything to be all better. And he says, we hope that Lee's Dokdo visit is not just a one-off event to cover the criticisms of his low-posture diplomacy towards Japan. So there's clearly not a moment of partisan unity here that some people see. And that speech also kind of coincided with Moon really ripping into his chief rival, Park Geun-hye, over some remarks that her father had reportedly made during the 1965 treaty negotiations. So again, we get back to this treaty. And I guess there was a moment when he was negotiating the treaty, and obviously Dokdo was a kind of a problem. And there's this little note in the side of the notes that of the U.S. State Department representative at the meeting, saying that President Park had commented that he would like to bomb the island out of existence to resolve the problem. So this is in the U.S. Somebody found this in the National Archives a few years back. And so, he was probably just joking around.
Yes.
But he's obviously, not super excited about the idea of really dying on the hill of trying to keep Dokdo. And so it's a comment that can be taken a lot of different ways. And this was really a way for Moon to just kind of witheringly disparage Park and the Conservative Party's commitment to Dokdo at a time when Lee Myung-bak had hoped that he would kind of solve all his problems just by visiting Dokdo. So it became almost more of a partisan issue through that whole incident and through this coming out of this memorandum.
Let's go to another incident, and this one I remember this quite visually myself, and this is of course the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, but not just the impeachment, of course, but all the stuff that happens around it and the turn that Moon Jae-in begins to make around this time as well. So Park Geun-hye is, of course, impeached in early 2017. And at the height of those protests and all the anger is March 1st. And I'll let you explain the significance of March 1st and the March 1st movement. But you have this quote, and it's a quote I personally remember from Moon because it's stuck with me. He has this speech, and he says, even now, nearly a century from the founding of the Republic of Korea, we have not yet been able to create a truly democratic republic. Now, for people from the outside, that begins to sting the ears a little bit. This South Korea is definitely a democratic republic. But Moon is, again, I'll let you open this up, but he is making some deep allusions to the idea perhaps that these collaborators have held on to power ever since, and they've never really become democratic in the way they hoped to.
Right. So this was March 1st, 2017, right? After Park Geun-hye had been impeached and before she was formally removed from office, but everybody knew it was coming in just a few days. And so they were already gearing up for the snap election. And at the time, there were something like 15 candidates, and probably as many as 6 or 7 serious candidates at the time, which is remarkable when you think about the way these things usually happen. So as a political scientist, this is kind of a nice opportunity because you have a broad spectrum of people from different fringe parties and a few people in the same party running for the nomination. And they're all expected to make a speech on the same day, March 1st. Because that's the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1919, which liberals consider to be the founding of the Republic of Korea. That's another interesting partisan argument, historical argument. But anyway, so this was a day when anyone who's a serious candidate for president is going to have to make a speech. And I was lucky enough to be living in Korea at the time. I was on a Fulbright scholarship. And I remember that day, they all made their speeches, but the locations that they chose and the backgrounds that they chose and their remarks were all very carefully chosen in a way that sort of represented this dichotomy between progressives who really get into the colonial history and the meaning of the March 1st movement and trying to tie it to the candlelight vigils that were happening at the time, and the conservative side who are still kind of trying to cling to some semblance of dignity, but they're in the middle of this really horrible impeachment scandal, and they're I think the main person who had been expected to be Park Geun-hye's successor had already bowed out. So you have this kind of rat race of people who maybe are trying to figure out how they can spin themselves into a viable candidacy, and for the conservative side, they're clearly a lot less comfortable talking about the colonial era and the dictatorship era, and they kind of are all of their remarks are something along the lines of like, let's all move on and let's look to the future and not the past. And then there are a few. There's one who says something about how the world is being, all over the world, leftists are being driven from power, and yet here in South Korea, they're still a threat. And it's like, why are you talking about this on the day when we should be talking about the March 1st movement? So you see some of these non sequiturs, and it was just really interesting to me to watch how these different candidates are trying to define themselves in terms of, the main event of the day, of course, was the Gwanghwamun Square protest movements and the candlelight rallies every single weekend. So there was a really interesting parallel between, trying to draw a parallel between that and what happened 100 years ago. So it was really fertile ground for anyone who's interested in the connections between historiography and politics.
And reading your article, it read really well. It was fascinating. These battling sides all fighting for the true spirit of March 1st. Let's jump into another episode. And this, I mean, this is pretty recent, actually. This is 2019, and this Japan-Korea trade war kicks off. And for people who were here in Korea at the time or watched the news, everyone's walking around with these signs that simply say "No Japan." And at this time, I'll get you to explain the episode and why it's so important. But you sum it up really neatly here, and this really hits a nail to anyone doubting these dual antagonisms here. And this is what you write. You write, the Moon administration announced its intention to unilaterally terminate GOMSA, or GSO MIA, essentially pitting anti-Japanese sentiment directly against North Korean threat perceptions. So I'll open that space up for you and get you to explain the trade arguments, but of course also that very clear splintering movement that quote of yours opens up for us.
Yeah. So again, this was a time when I just happened to be in Korea and fortunately was able to witness this moment when I think it's pretty easily argued was the nadir of Japan-South Korea relations for at least the last 5 years, when you can argue about what started it, but basically it was the beginning, what looked like the beginnings of a very targeted trade war between Japan taking some retaliatory trade moves in response to a South Korean court ruling about colonial history, and then South Korea reacting, the public reacting particularly strongly and saying, we can't let Japan use its economic weight to bully us into backing down from these historical issues. And at the same time, I think the GSOMIA security agreement thing might have been sort of a coincidence that, it has to be renewed every so often by the administration in power. And people already kind of thought that Moon would try to not renew it because of, he'd made his attitudes fairly well known. So that might have just been a matter of timing, but it obviously brings in this question of, what are we really afraid of? What is the bigger threat to South Korea today? Is it North Korea, or is it Japan's not being sufficiently regretful about the events of the past and not respecting Korean sovereignty? Obviously from the American perspective, GSOMIA is by far the more important thing. It should be, and ultimately Moon was not able to withdraw from GSOMIA, I think mostly because of American pressure, and the public didn't really seem to be fully behind it. But I show some numbers in the paper. I show some figures of the level of public support for withdrawing from GSOMIA, and also for the anti-Japan boycott that was going on that summer. And you can see a clear division along party lines of the liberal side being much more enthusiastic about the boycott and much more in favor of withdrawing from the security agreement with Japan. And then, of course, the main point of my methodology is to compare what's going on in the political rhetoric of the time. And so I look at some of the National Assembly debates concerning what to do about this trade conflict. And there's, even though it's about, it's almost a year away at this point when all this starts to happen. There's an upcoming National Assembly election in April 2020, and you can see both sides really kind of lining up their arguments in terms of how are we going to deal with Japan, and who is really protecting the country from the biggest threat. Is it North Korea or is it Japan? So that dovetails into the beginning of the campaign for the National Assembly, and you start to see these, I guess they're more memes than posters. I think they were probably also used as posters, but these posters, these memes show up saying, the National Assembly election is a Korea-Japan fight. And then you see this rival set of memes coming out saying the National Assembly election is a South-North fight, Nambukjeon. And they use the same font. They're obviously playing off of each other and trying to say, this is what we should care about. Korea should care about the North-South fight, or the Korea-Japan fight. And one thing I didn't really get timed, I didn't really work into the paper because it was kind of tangential, but right at the very end in April of 2020, right before the election, the people who made the North-South fight poster switched it to Hanjungjun, which is a Korea-China fight, because that was the beginning of all the stuff about coronavirus and public opinion really turning against China. And so you can see they pivoted instantly. They said, okay, we're still anti-communist, but now we're going to bring in China, and maybe that will get more resonance. And it was at the very end, it probably didn't really make a difference, but it was just interesting to see that movement related to the coronavirus.
There is another moment in there which is really fascinating as well, and you lay it out in detail here. And this was an accusation labeled against Moon Jae-in. So again, this is against Moon Jae-in, but it shows that the anti-Japanese sentiment gets thrown around with an awful lot of abandon here. And there's this, he is attacked. And people go through his family background and start to pull it apart and start to claim that he has 3 generations of pro-Japanese collaborators within his family. And even he himself perhaps was pro-Japanese, because the accusation was in 1987, Moon, as a lawyer at the time, represented the family of the then deceased Kim Ji-tae, who was put on the list, one of the first names on the lists of these collaborators. And Moon manages to get his family 5 billion Korean won, about $5 million US, in this lawsuit. And I bring it up not just for how fascinating it is, because it's an accusation getting thrown back at Moon himself about being pro-Japanese, but because when you write that when the encyclopedia, the IRCA encyclopedia, is published in 2007, Kim's name, Kim Ji-tae's name, is omitted from there, and people allege that Moon stepped in himself and interceded on behalf of his former client. Now that's speculation, but we haven't got into these textbook controversies very much either yet. So I might use that as a way to begin to open up how this battle over history is an awful lot to do with the battle over textbooks as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that incident really highlights how complicated the reality of the colonial history is. So there's the perception, which I've talked about, that that most of the collaborators were descendants are on the conservative side, and then there's the reality, which is that it's a lot more complicated. And the mainstream liberal party today, a lot of them kind of splintered off from people who were moderate conservatives in the 90s, and it goes back to people who had access to education and were fairly upper class in the dictatorship period tended to be descended from people who had done very well in the colonial era, whether it was just being, a regular business person or being in some kind of clerkship, or so when you start compiling these lists and these encyclopedias of who did what in the colonial era, it gets really sticky because there's the question of who was really serving the colonial government and who was just a smart person who had a good job and happened to make some money. And so you get into kind of rival historiography. And so it's hard to say why some people are taken off the list or put on the list later. And obviously people took an interest in the fact that Moon Jae-in used to be a lawyer, and he represented the family, the descendants of this accused collaborator in the 1980s in a property restitution lawsuit. And basically the government had taxed them for some of their property that they had inherited from the colonial era, and then he successfully got their money back for them. So money is involved, and collaborators are involved, and it's a very classic case that some of the conservatives said, well, if anyone in our party had done that, this would have been a big news, and yet because Moon is on the other side of the aisle, he seems to kind of get away with it. So I'm not taking any particular stance on it, but it was an interesting illustration of how these families are intertwined. And I also show some of the posters from that National Assembly election where they tried to, where the Liberal Party said, we should go after conservatives who are specifically pro-Japan. And then conservatives came up with their own rival poster campaign and said, well, if you want to talk about pro-Japan, you should look at these people. And the poster was all these people who were, their father or their grandfather or their great aunt had done something for the colonial government. So it kind of went back and forth in interesting ways, and ended up being an interesting dispute. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question about?
It was about the textbooks.
Yes, the textbooks. I'm also glad that you asked, because I had a section about that, and then I threw it out because the paper was too long. But so Park Geun-hye had, during her administration, one of the things that she did that was kind of a head scratcher was that she tried to push through this nationalization of history textbooks in South Korea that kind of downplayed a lot of the elements of the harsher elements of her father, Park Chung-hee's dictatorship, and also kind of gave a little softer view of colonial history. It didn't really talk about the collaborator issue, and so that ended up not going through. But it was an early example of how kind of the moderates in both parties help to get, the leadership takes these kind of crazy moves, and then the moderates kind of get them to back down from it. And obviously, it wasn't a good look for the conservative president to be pushing this nationalization of textbooks in general, but specifically the way that, the specific contents of the textbook brought a lot of attention to this issue. And I think that the issue of creating a national textbook has been on and off for a number of years. it'll be interesting to see if it comes up again under a new conservative administration. But that was just another episode that I ended up not working into the paper.
A final incident, a final passage, and moment that you run through in your article. And this one is very modern. And I think for anyone still doubting that there are these dual antagonisms within South Korean politics, this should put the nail in the coffin of this. And this is the proposed act on the prohibition of falsification of history. That's the official title of it. So I'll set this up. In June 2020, Moon Jae-in is in power. The Liberals are riding high. They have a control of the Blue House. They have a supermajority in the National Assembly. And they have a unique amount of power to change the landscape of South Korean politics and South Korean security. And for many people on the South Korean left, this would be, and this is what you write in your article, this wonderful moment where they can finally get rid of that national security law, that horrible law that was written incredibly vague and allowed basically the National Security Service to target people for these, almost minor infractions. And this thing that they've always rallied against and spoken out loud about and protested against. And now they had this chance to get rid of it. And instead of getting rid of it, they go ahead and try and pass a law on the other side of it that would be almost identical. And you write that in its actual language, it is very similar to the national security law. And in effect, it would have handed South Korea, it would be handing South Korea two of these national security laws, simply button up against either different sides of those antagonisms that you were speaking about.
Yeah, so there were several laws actually in 2020. One that passed that prohibits falsification of the events of the May 18th, the Gwangju uprising, and I believe that has gone into law and is was recently applied for the first time against someone, because there are various far right factions who believe and try to argue that the Gwangju massacre of 1980, the very violent uprising against the military dictatorship, was somehow fomented by North Korean agents. And so, they say this is very hurtful. That it's one thing to protect free speech, but this is hurting the memory of the martyrs of that uprising. And so that is actually illegal now to make that argument. And that passed in early 2020 from the Liberal, was proposed by the Liberal Party and passed. And then later in mid 2020, after they had taken this overwhelming majority in the National Assembly, they proposed a few more amendments. And one was this prohibition of falsification of history that specifically mentioned, I believe, the Sewol-ho incident, the sinking of the Sewol ferry, and also the Japanese, anything praising the Japanese colonial period or sympathizing with organizations that seek to justify colonial rule. And that specific phrase, praises, incites, or sympathizes with, is taken verbatim from the Article 7 of the NSL, which penalizes anyone who praises, incites, or propagates the activities of, basically pro-North Korean organization. So, there were these proposed amendments, and then the reaction from most public intellectuals and influencers was pretty negative, and I think that those amendments didn't get anywhere close to being passed or getting through the committee even. But it was interesting to hear the way the language that was used by the lawmakers promoting it, talking about we need to have a correct historical consciousness, which is the exact same phrase that you hear from a lot of people on the right who are trying to, like when they tried to do the textbook reform under Park Geun-hye, they used the exact same phrase, a correct historical consciousness, or correct history. So it's a very interesting tit for tat. And then even later in the year, the conservative lawmakers, obviously they have no power, but they proposed a law, the similar language targeting historical distortions of the Cheonan incident, the sinking of the Navy ship in 2010. So, you've got Sewol-ho, and then, if you can't talk about that, then you can't talk about the Cheonan sinking either. And so you have these two sides that are kind of piling on more laws restricting speech and versions of history, and access to alternative interpretations of these kind of historical bugbears of both progressive and conservative sides, as opposed to, they could have just tried to revise Article 7 of the NSL and have do away with some of these restrictions on free speech, but they seem to give up on that. I think that it's really disappointing, but perhaps it wasn't politically feasible at the time, given that the Moon administration was already kind of had a reputation for being too soft on North Korea, and had spent a lot of political capital trying to make this pro-North engagement policy work. So I can see why it would have been really difficult for them to also try to revise the NSL at that time. But it's really disappointing that they went in the opposite direction from that. So that's where I end the paper, basically.
Well, you end the paper with two quick thoughts, and I might ask you about both of them now quickly as a last two questions here. The first one was, you begin to, let's go back to those IR scholars, those poor international relations scholars struggling to understand South Korea. And you begin to say, and I won't give any of this away, I'll let you explain it yourself, that there are a few, from your article and from what we've seen in it, there are a few implications that policymakers and these IR scholars should learn if they're interested in building a stronger, more cooperative alliance. So what are the implications coming from your article for those people?
So I try to end on a bit of a more positive note. I bring in, there's an idea from kind of diplomatic history that is that it takes a Nixon to go to China. In other words, you need sometimes having the perceived hawkish leader make this breakthrough in a relationship can actually be more of a long-term achievement than if the dovish leader makes an attempt at reconciliation. So this is in the context of Nixon going to China. You wouldn't expect a conservative Republican president to be the one to make a breakthrough with communist China in the 70s. And yet, because he was able to do that, it was accepted by both conservatives who otherwise would have been extremely skeptical, and obviously the liberal side who would have been more enthusiastic about it anyway. And so when you apply this to the domestic situation, you can argue that when you expect the conservative side to be more pro-Japan, if a conservative Korean leader is going to make a security arrangement or like Park Geun-hye's Comfort Women deal, you know that that's not going to last past the next election because the liberal side won't accept it. So we should instead be trying to find a way for liberal moderates to make these sorts of deals with Japan so that they can bring their side into it. That the conservative side will probably go along. And conversely with North Korea. So I guess that's the more the relationship we should be focusing on with this next president, is the idea that if you have a liberal like Moon Jae-in, he makes all of these initiatives towards North Korea, but they're not going to last past the next election. So instead, we should if we want to move forward and make some lasting achievements, even though it's a lot harder to accomplish under a hawkish conservative leadership, it's more meaningful in the end if it can be achieved. Even a modest improvement in that relationship under someone like incoming President Yoon would probably be longer lasting and more stable than something done under outgoing President Moon.
Last question, and again from the very last page in your article here, and this is a quote: "If this impasse is to be resolved, moderates will play an essential role." So why will moderates play an essential role if we can get over these dual antagonisms in South Korean politics? And what are the hopes? How hopeful is it that moderates will bring and bridge and drag South Korea out of this impasse?
Well, you always have to have hope. I say that moderates will be essential because obviously, when things are polarized to this extent, it's almost impossible to convince a dyed-in-the-wool conservative or liberal leader to take a chance and engage in an attempt at this Nixon goes to China kind of moment. But if you have a moderate leader who's not really married to this kind of ideological warfare that's been going on, a more practical-minded leader who could maybe be persuaded to see the other side's perspective enough to say, we can't keep having these dueling laws, cracking down on speech on either side, and then as soon as the other side gets into power, they reverse it. It would be much more efficient for both sides to come to some sort of agreement and pursue a moderating influence on some of these restrictions on speech and restrictions on, complete rejection of any attempt to normalize the relationship with Japan, or any attempt to outreach to North Korea and just immediately turn that into a partisan fight. Instead of doing that, maybe these two dueling antagonisms could be eased in tandem with each other. That's the only way that I can see this situation resolving itself, because that both sides kind of need this antagonism to survive, and as politicians, they're interested in their own survival and the survival of their party. So it's kind of mutual assured destruction, and we need to move that in a direction of kind of more moderate. Both sides will somehow survive, even if this source of antagonism goes away. So that's what I'm hoping for the future, and we'll just have to see.
Well, that is also a great note to end the podcast on, of course. The article we've been speaking about is Godzilla versus Pulgasari, anti-Japanism and anti-communism as dual antagonisms in South Korean politics. We only touched on the bare minimum and brushed the surface. It's a very interesting read, and so much more detail in there that we didn't get to. So I'm going to link it below, and I really cannot encourage listeners enough to go and get a hold of it and read it for themselves. On that, Meredith Shaw, thank you so much for your time. It's always such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.